Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. One thing that I found particularly interesting is using this sort of almost mix of different activities in the blockchain to create diversity. Now, what came to mind was so you went through liquid democracy. There's another alternative democratic model called delegative democracy, and that uses more sort of random participation in order to get I guess a bit more diversity in the decision making, but also increased participation amongst participants that may not have already sort of been exposed to the network. I guess like I haven't read the paper from 22 yet, so I'd love I will be, but did you go through that model as a potential?
No, yes, I did.
Okay.
We are back to the idea of the fact that consensus a little bit influences, even only for a matter as a matter of coherence, consistency, what you do in governance. Algorithm, for example, doesn't have delegation of staking, and so it sounds strange to do delegation of Cardano has got delegation of staking, but I think that even Cardano has not yet started with the creation of delegate representatives. I'll tell you what. I'm obviously very curious to see what happens. I can tell you that yes, there are risks, you know, in a sense. How can this avoid reducing only to buying votes, you know, in a sense? But it's also true that this can happen in any form of voting. So it's not enough to say I don't even want to try. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen in Cardano. I think it's going to happen pretty soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So let's thank Massimo again. And now we start our panel. I would ask each panelist to briefly introduce yourself, what you do, what's your area of expertise, and a comment on these general terms of governance in decentralized system from your viewpoint, future direction, whatever. Thank you.
Great. So I'll start, which I'm sure it's great to start with the former regulator. I don't know if anybody else here has that prior role. House too. So I'm Carol House. Currently, I'm an executive resident at TerraNet Ventures, a small venture capital firm focused on tech with national security applications. But I worked on crypto specifically in the White House, driving a lot of the work around the digital asset executive order, as well as supporting the counter ransomware campaign for USG. But I also was at FinCEN driving identity, crypto, and cyber policy, and then had a background in hard cyber across the hill, OMB, and then the Army before that. So anyway, like I came into crypto the way that a lot of people in NASDAQ do, through cybercrime, and cyber criminals' favorite way to launder is cryptocurrency. So that was my exposure to it all, including like not just the terrifying reality of how it's being used, but also the incredible, fantastic benefits that you get from kind of ledgers that are traceable and opportunities for info sharing and disruption. As the often regulator heavy on some panels, I don't think it will surprise anyone that accountability, I think, is really the key issue related to decentralized governance. I'm currently the chair of the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee. The CFTC is the commodities regulator in the United States. But DeFi is one of the major issues that we're looking at, and accountability was highlighted by the commissioner that reconstituted the TAC to really try to examine what are some concrete ways for us to move forward. And the reality was I saw for so long that industry would focus on the first letter in DAO, decentralized, and try to move to say, well, when am I decentralized enough that there's no accountability in government? And I thought that was interesting, since I felt like naturally government would look at the third letter in DAO, organization, which is also a part of the definition of person and entity under almost every financial statute, whether it's the Commodities Exchange Act, securities laws, Bank Secrecy Act, IEFA. Unincorporated organizations are all captured underneath that. And aside from just the fact that I think that there's regulatory needs, the sector just needs it. A good governance is a critical part of effectively operating decentralized finance. And frankly, I'm really excited to hear about the interesting innovations that are happening in that space, and where the market is evolving to establish and determine where accountability exists in the DeFi stack, since you can do it at the application layer, but you also can do it at the network layer, protocol layer, you know, and you can do it all the way to end users. But figuring out what it looks like for each unique ecosystem that has its own facts and circumstances, I think is critical. And it would be best if industry comes to that understanding and agreement about where accountability should exist, because if industry does not, then regulators will probably do it for them, and then nobody will be happy. So that's my thought.
We're playing a strange game with the microphones here, but we'll figure it out. My name is Don Beaver. I am an employee chief cryptographer for a trading and technology company called Jump, which is in largely the investment and bridging of crypto assets. I've been in the cryptography world for a good 2 or 3 decades at this point, with kind of a little bit of a gap in between. More of a mathematician than anything else. My interests in the beginning were being piqued by the notion that you could take a democracy and implement it in a technological way. So at the same time, once you figured out how to do that in a mathematical way, the next step is like, what do you actually do with it? It's sort of like the step from going from being a nuclear physicist to figuring out what you're going to do with this nuclear energy. There are clearly a couple of different paths you can go in. And I have a feeling with every kind of technology, there always will be a couple of different paths that you can go in. So it behooves us all, whether we're mathematicians, regulators, or other citizens, to actually participate in this. And I don't think I have any more authority than anybody in this room to speak on the subject, because I'm not deeply involved in regulation, but I'm deeply involved in the technology side. So my opinions here are, first of all, are purely my own, but secondly, in part, I feel like that I can actually maybe offer occasionally some opinions about what is possible, what's not possible. And I think the deeper questions that are for us all to decide are, what should we do and what should we not do? And where's the balance between control over a government by each of us versus the government's, reasonable control of each of us to keep us in a civilized society as well. And I think that drawing the knobs there is the important thing to do, and figuring out how to be able to turn those knobs is an important side of it too.
Hi everyone, I'm Ed Felton. A brief biography. I was a professor at Princeton University for 28 years in computer science, and then later also in public policy school. During that time, I twice took leaves to work in the US government, first Federal Trade Commission, which is the consumer protection and competition agency in the US as their chief technologist, and then later on the White House staff as Deputy United States CTO, which was a policy advising job rather than a job where I ever wrote code. I'm also now more recently co-founder and chief scientist at Off-Chain Labs. We're the company that developed Arbitrum, which is the leading layer 2 scaling solution for Ethereum. And as you may know, Arbitrum recently transitioned to community governance. And my perspective on these topics is driven a lot by the thinking process and the experience with that transition. One of the things that we knew was, and I want to focus on a couple of issues there just very quickly. I'm not going to give you the full download because, the session ends before midnight. But I want to focus on a couple of things. First of all, at least for a system like Arbitrum, much of what governance has to decide is technical in nature. There are a lot of decisions about upgrades and technical directions for the protocol. As the layer 2 protocol, it needs to interoperate with and be compatible with Ethereum. There are lots of technical opportunities that are available, and decisions about priorities and risk versus reward and so on in very technical areas are really an important part of what the governance needs to work with. And so there was a lot of thought that went into how to maximize the chance that those decisions would be made well. There was also a lot of thinking about this design of this mechanism in much the same way that you try to do in doing good engineering, which is to be humble about what you know and don't know, and to be careful to really optimize for not making mistakes, as opposed to trying to push the envelope in every area. The other thing that, let me just put out there as food for thought, is that if you're talking about upgrades and development and technical direction, you can have a very slow, public, and deliberative process. But the other situation that can arise is something like a critical security vulnerability. And then you need to be able to act quickly and decisively, and you need to be able to deliberate in a way that's not necessarily public, because we can't have a 2-week public debate about the nature of the critical security vulnerability. And so in designing these mechanisms, the people involved settled on a dual approach where there is a very public and open deliberative process. Then there's also a security council, which is elected by the DAO, which is able to act quickly and decisively in case of a technical emergency, but only with a strong supermajority. So I come at all these things with an engineering mindset and anchored in the particulars of what needs to happen and in considerations of risk and knowledge. But let me stop there and pass it on.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this great panel. And my name is Haruki from the Digital Agency in Japan. And Digital Agency is just started 2 years ago for facilitating the digital strategy for Japanese agencies. And also I've been working as a branding civic tech community for the Code for Japan and more than 10 years. And through that experiences, I have been facilitating the decentralized community, but it's difficult to organize and try to include this kind of Web3 mechanism to our community, but it is very difficult to utilize emerging tech to existing communities, because the kind of using that kind of technology makes people difficult to interact with people. So and also as a digital agency, I am an expert for the open government, and also I have been involved in the Web3 research DAO in that agency. And also I have that agency invited many experts in the field and formed DAO to learn what kind of things can do with DAO. And also recently DAO itself is not so active, unfortunately, because many experts are busy, and also there are no value creation capacity yet. So we decided to restart now to invite more people that have a strong motivation to rulemaking or researching, and also we utilize the kind of we are planning to utilize the new token ecosystem to facilitate the DAO, but we are starting. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Joey. I started off in 2012 building mining rigs out of milk crates and GTX X80s. I'm now 11 years on, the partner, co-founder of Solvis, a bespoke consultancy that advises on everything from CBCs to steady rewards and profitable mechanisms onto integrating digital asset infrastructure for planning offices. Was one of the co-founders for co-authors of the SBT Part 1 paper for BGIN, where myself and Shin'ichiro Matsuo, my co-author from UC Berkeley, published this large paper 21,000 words later in a very short period of time. That was thankfully cited by the JDA and the Web3 research report, and equally has been cited now as some core research also on tokens and tokenizing reputation, putting betting reputation also technical value within this internet value. That's me.
Okay. Let's go for the first round of questions. Any interest in particular? Quick question with answer.
Hi, I think this is a very important topic, but something we try to consider for real life. European Union, for example, we have 27 member states, and some of decision making there is like distributed, so it's a representative way, but still one can think of it as decentralized, not like autonomous or based on technical, but essentially your member states, which we have our representatives, and decision making is essentially like democratized. So how do you see or comment this democratization versus decentralization? How do you see this?
Who wants to?
I'll mention one quick thing, I guess, as a technologist. That is the perfect question, because in the early days for me, it was about decentralization. It was about distributing the world to make it possible for everybody to play a role, to avoid absolute control by absolute dictators, and to also to produce a world in which, by all of us participating, we could perform a function as though there were a beneficent dictator there. But that then starts leaking into what is a democracy, and does that function, and what are all the rules and incentives and ways you can go awry. The challenging part is then to actually come up with those sets of rules that you want to comply with, at which point I will hand it off to somebody else.
Thank you. I'll take it.
Just a quick comment on this. I think one of the mistakes that folks in this community often make is to forget that humans have been experimenting and studying how to do governance for thousands of years. And although it's a very difficult area, there are some things that we as a world community know about what sorts of governance are more effective and work better than others. And it's really useful for us to try to learn from those things. It's helpful to have some people who understand social organization, understand political science involved in thinking about how to set up a decentralized governance system. They don't know all of the answers, but they at least can help us avoid making easy mistakes.
Really quickly, I like that. I think that the two absolutely can be connected, but they also exist on a spectrum, right? Like our democracy is a representative one. The United States, or really every major democracy, is like for every sanctions designation that comes out, it's not asking every American to come and vote on it, and every other vote that's happening in Congress, et cetera, and what the executive branch does. So I think that these things exist all in spectrums, and their implementations look different. And then also we'll continue to say that the word accountability also exists in democracies in a really helpful way, and like voted on and driven by the community, but then also enforced within the community and the sector as well. So I think those are all really important to consider in the context of DeFi.
It's a very interesting question. And one thing that it makes me think about is that it's true that there is an interesting background, historical background of research on these topics. In fact, we work, with the digital economists and work paper. We were inspired, by the Austrian principles in order to create governance. But it's also interesting how the social and now even the technological layers evolve at such a speed that we always have new challenges and new opportunities. Probably the way I see, the relationship between decentralization and democratization is that decentralization is an attempt to reduce the scope of governance as much as possible, reducing that to pure self-governance. That is something that usually we like, up to a point, because then there is instead what is the common framework, and in that case, democratization kicks in.
Yeah, I would add a few comments. And I the photo Japan. I organized Duality Tokyo last month. The Duality term Duality is created by the Audrey Khan from Taiwan and the Kemion from Greenville from the
the priority is the movement for utilizing the technology for improving the democracy itself. And Taiwan is the front line of the kind of experimentation data of trying to use structured voting and the IDs for making good consensus. So yeah, that kind of things that should be considered, I think.
All right, I like this discussion and I like the title as I came in towards decentralized governance. And my question is, where are we coming from? So towards always points to something. And the one thing that absolutely strikes me is that when we talk about the notion of decentralization, I think there's actually, in technical terms, I think there's actually two traditions. And one, that's kind of the cyberpunk tradition, is I want decentralization in a sense of I can get something done for myself individually without any single party being able to stop me. Yeah, I mean, I can send this message anonymously. I can make this publication without anybody being able to censor it. I can make this payment when I want, nobody can stop me. And so this is a way of decentralizing a system for individual goals. And when we talk about towards decentralized governance, we are suddenly changing the focus. Yeah, it's not about my individual goal anymore, but we suddenly want to solve a sort of choice problem. Yeah, find something that affects everybody. And so I want to ask you what your take on this is. I mean, do you see the same distinction? Do you think it needs different approaches? And can something that has worked in one domain directly also apply to the other?
Personally, I think there's a lot of semantics around the two terminologies, centralized, decentralized. You can say that something is centralized, if that's an absolute term, then it means that it's one. If it's greater than that, then it's decentralized. But then the distance between centralization to decentralization, that also could be measured. I think everything always leads to centralization, and everyone here, our role is to make sure that we try to mitigate that. Simple.
I think if you're thinking about building or designing a space or a facility whose purpose is for people to interact with each other, and especially if it's a platform to allow people to build services for richer and more multilateral types of interaction, then you do have to have some governance to understand how that's going to work, which direction it's going to take, what are the economics that are going to underlie it, and all of that. If it really is just sort of a set of atomized activities done by individuals, then that's much less necessary. But I think much of what we are doing here really has to do with building those shared and interactive spaces. And it's hard to see how you could do those without governance because there are decisions that need to be made.
I mean, I think you're actually getting on a very interesting middle ground in this. So to some degree, there is a kind of direction towards anarchy, if you like, or libertarianism in spirit, which says that each of us should be able to do what we wish, with borderlines there, where we're not harming others, I guess. Sort of a natural assumption for most people. But one of the things that really came through from the decentralization approach is really a bit more of a virtualization, I would want to say. So that it is, surely there's an n greater than one, but in a sense, a lot, if you look at how do you define security, how do you build these protocols, you have a functionality, you have a trusted third party, you imagine a world in which there are in fact some set of rules, kind of leave for later what those rules actually are. But what you're wanting to do is to create a society or an interaction or a group in which through the decentral actions of all of us participating, we keep that set of rules, that trusted third party honest. They don't really exist. We don't trust a king or a queen. We trust in this system that keeps us all honest. And whether that's a multi-party protocol, whether that's a zero-knowledge proof. A zero-knowledge proof is what? In the early days, it was a proof of a theorem. These days, it's a proof of a behavior in general. I've done something according to the prescribed rules that I'm supposed to behave according to, and I'm just going to tell you I did it. And for, privacy reasons, I'm not going to tell you exactly what I did, but I'm just going to tell you I operated within the confines of the laws or the specifications that we came up with in the beginning. So we replaced the central, in a certain sense, with the decentral. But what we've left unspoken in so many of these cases, and Ed is referring to that as well, what are those interactions going to look like? What are the constraints we're going to either vote on or agree on and then use as our basis in a decentrally implemented?
So I absolutely love the comments for all the panelists, so I won't speak to all the benefits, the necessity that exists for governance, but I love the issue that you pointed to as one that I continue to well, I think sure that all of us face it, because frankly, the crypto industry is also on a spectrum of some people on a very maximalist position on both sides, recently, I was trying to talk to folks about the fact, like, okay, let's talk about this future where maybe we're not as reliant on intermediaries, and you can't rely on off-ramps anymore. So basically, the application layer no longer is this focus. Now, of course, I happen to like intermediaries. I don't keep all of my cash underneath my mattress, but who am I to tell people not to do that? And the future may actually be people not relying upon intermediaries. Like, what do I know? Intermediaries and focusing on application layer, most current existing regulatory frameworks can work there. And accountability is a little bit easier on that front. But when you go beyond that, then you get into layers where in the internet technology space, people like validators and miners will sometimes claim that they should be treated just like internet service providers and regulated that way. And ultimately, our regulatory frameworks for information transfer and internet systems are very different from value transfer. So like the role of identity, the need for discoverability, now you have rails that can support simultaneously value transfer and information transfer, and with the right obfuscation, you can't tell which is in fact happening. And basically your idea about this common good, there's this sort of greater understanding, certainly with in bodies like the FATF, where you have 200 jurisdictions that have all come together. There's not many things where you have 200 countries all agreeing on anything, but we've all agreed that anti-money laundering standards are critical. And that kind of agreement around very rigid controls in the internet system is not the same thing. There's certainly internet governance bodies like IEEE and ICANN, but it's not the same level of rigor. So in the decentralized world, I see conversations where I highlight the things that keep me up at night are this future of pure decentralization, where you have a darknet marketplace that's supporting CSAM material, and it's not on a couple of servers in Eastern Europe, but it's on 1,000 mobile devices around the world, and I can never take it down with the sufficient law enforcement action because the right governance mechanism is not built in to stop that. Or even asking hey, what if the DeFi sector just picks its biggest bads, like North Korea? Great example. It's a heinous regime conducting terrible things against its population, proliferation activities, and is directly stealing from the crypto sector. Why are we validating these transfers going to North Korea when it's publicly known that it's them and it's happening? And ultimately, the reactions that I got from industry was, of course, we wouldn't censor North Korea because then you could censor other people. And I don't know what the sort of vision is for some of the DeFi space, but I would encourage the space to consider what kind of reckoning might be needed to determine how they want to hold accountable and root out bad actors. I think some systems are already evolving that way, but others are not very open to that conversation. And to them, it's against the whole ethos of why they created those systems in the first place.
I fear that I have not yet an answer to the question. No, again, I have to say that first of all, I like the way you formulated the question, and I like all the comments. But in a sense, I don't think there is a contradiction, and maybe the last comment from the panel is helping us in getting to the point. Essentially, when we started this path to the decentralization, for example, I was a bank. Also, for me, it was very clear, how a bank is managed, and governed. And even how a regulator can look at the bank, because it was a centralized unit. And then you try to decentralize some of the activities. But in a sense, I realized that think of the different layers also of technology that we talk about when we talk about blockchain. There is a level about the internet, which is the fact that the blockchain is a peer-to-peer network. Then there is the fact that you use actually digital signature and cryptography at different level of identification. And apparently, I think that was the problem of the original CryptoPunks in the 90s. Say, okay, that's fine, essentially. Well, now we can create a digital currency. No, wait a second, because then you can have double spending and a lot of problems. you need to find a strong and valid consensus argument. And when you use the term consensus, already there is a little bit of a contradiction with decentralization, you know. And in fact, whatever consensus argument you think of, in the end, there is always someone that actually puts the block together, you know, in a sense. And decentralization remains because the consensus arguments are well designed to the maximum level of decentralization, even if there is a moment in which, you know, decentralizing the choice, there will be someone that needs to put together a block. And something similar happens when you realize that, okay, now we have this fantastic protocol. Protocol needs to be maintained, needs to be evolved. There are many things that need to be decided around that, you know, the resources and so on. And now at this point, you need to go back in a sense towards common decision, and you try to do that as decentralized as possible. And when you cannot, you try to do that as democratically as possible. That's the way I see the problem in a sense. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chloe White. I'm an independent consultant in the industry. My question is for Carol, and if there are any other views, but really interested in your comment about the willingness of some different stakeholders in the space to want to censor transactions, and framing this in a way of you know, if you don't self-regulate, the government's going to come and do it for you. And as an ex-regulator and former policymaker, I completely understand where you're coming from. I think the conversation that we tend not to have, which is one level above that, is to what extent is it desirable to use the financial system, whether it's TradFi or DeFi or FinTech, as a kind of proxy arm of, you know, police enforcement or national security. How far do we want to extend that? I think just across the financial markets generally, we're placing more and more of an onerous burden on financial organizations, and over the last 30, 40 years, what we've seen is a very steady decline in the capability of some of these organizations to cope with these compliance obligations and costs, and those costs are also being passed on to the rest of the private sector and society. And so, kind of flipping the question in reverse, to what extent do you think that policymakers and governments are willing to reflect on the extent to which it's appropriate to use financial markets in that way? What about other methods of law enforcement and national security tools? Because I guess that the challenge is that when it goes beyond crime into things that are simply disliked, we start to embed a lot of value judgments into how we monitor financial realm, and that's where I think a lot of the concern comes from around censorship and rights and privacy and so forth.
Yeah, it's a critical issue, and you're right that like the basis of a good AML framework is sound rule of law and checks and balances, and of course that can look very different depending on if you're sitting under an authoritarian regime or a democracy. So in a democracy, continuing to hold accountable our elected officials and things to make sure that laws ensure the protections of people. And I'll say that under the FATF standards, was a Financial Action Task Force, it's the AML regulator for the US, kind of like the ISO or the UN for AML requirements. So underneath those standards and in the US AML framework, it's not a system of entire state surveillance. Obviously, there is information that can be discovered. There's information that must be reported and create some transparency, but there's also protections around certain data being disclosed and very rigid protections around the use of that data. So I'll say that everything is a risk-based approach, which is the right way. That the point of these frameworks is to root out money laundering and terrorism financing. It started from the understanding that terrorism financing in your jurisdiction is going to fund terrorism in mine. Therefore, this must be an international standards framework. We cannot do it individually, state by state alone. and why the framework was created, not just with policy, but also with enforcement mechanisms built into it. The issues around human rights abuses, as well as privacy, are highlighted as key priorities in the FATF framework. It's certainly a consideration for the US anytime that we take a regulatory measure. And I think even, for example, in the instance of Russia's continued unprovoked aggression and war in Ukraine, the FATF has taken punitive measures against Russia for those kinds of actions. And so I would say that there are instances of where countries that have all agreed that holding accountable bad actors in finance, which is critical, because while everybody may not all believe in certain types of governance, certain types of systems, criminals believe in money. In fact, most crime is for the purposes of making money, and almost all crime requires money in order to successfully perpetrate it, and to continue to reward those behind it. And that's why those international standards do have to exist. I think it's entirely fair to ask about the efficacy of AML frameworks. That was totally behind the AML Act that was passed in the United States, and some work that FinCEN continues to go under to evaluate the efficacy of its AML framework. I actually think that decentralized systems and the availability of info on public ledgers could make things, lead us to a system where we could dare criminals to launder on public ledgers, and where we could preserve appropriate privacy, ensure appropriate discoverability, and have more information available to more properly detect illicit activity, so that we can have a more effective AML framework in the long term. But some governance decisions and evolutions in the marketplace have to happen, as well as some regulatory evolutions. So basically, it's a critical issue. They both have to be prioritized, and countries have to be held accountable by their populations or by other nations when they're not properly meeting the needs of human rights.
I don't know if anyone who is not a regulator can answer that, but in any case, I think that it's not so different from the previous question, in the sense that blockchain is incredibly transparent at the level of its fundamental layer. If everything around that, even how funds reach the blockchain zone, was equally transparent, that would be an incredible AML, and that's something in which you need to get transparency even beyond, the platform, but even in the surrounding reality. There is, I think, a little bit of this in the MiCA European regulation, when they put a lot of stress in transparency also of the projects that work on blockchain and so on. I think that is a good direction.
Hi, so my name is Ivan. I'm independent. Entrepreneur here in Asia, working in the currency business. I was just wondering if any one of you has ever participated in DAO governance, and I wanted to hear your experiences. What are your thoughts about it? What did you like and what didn't you like? And if you are available, you can maybe tell which ones did you participate in. Thank you.
Let me talk a little bit about the very short experience we have had with the Arbitrum DAO. For me, there is an echo of the way that I learned to think about the public in a democracy when working in government, right? And that is, and there's several aspects to that. One of them is beware an angry public. You can have high quality and thoughtful deliberation, but it is also the case that the public can become angry. And given the world that we live in and the social media that exists, rationality can be hard to find when people are really upset. And I think both of those are true. That there are people who think deeply and have an excellent model of what is good for the community, and who are willing to participate and self-organize to try to reach good governance, but also the occasional public flare-up is part of the story as well. And that is one of the prices that you pay. It's one of the risks that you take on, which are worth taking on in order to have democratic governance. I think you can't have open public deliberation without in today's world, having a risk of flare-ups, and you can become the main character on crypto Twitter for a week, whether you like it or not. But still, I think that these mechanisms can be effective, and I've actually, on the whole, been encouraged by what I've seen and heard in the 2 months of the Arbitrum DAO so far.
Sorry, just to add, can you just give us some more info about how did you feel about you're a disclosed person to the world, right? With your name and surname and
Yes.
everything, and most of the other people who participate are anonymous people, right? Pseudo people.
Actually, many of them not. Many of the people who are public who are prominent voices in the DAO and who are delegates are known by reputation one way or the other. Sometimes their real world name is known. Other times they have a persistent persona and name, which is as good as a stable identity. And so we don't see the people who are influential, the people who have larger delegations, for example, tend to be known. And if you think about it, that makes sense because these are people who have reputations and have a reputation for being thoughtful and being invested in the community and so on. That's where influence comes from in practice. So it has not been such a world of anons. I mean, a screaming social media mob will have a bunch of anons in it, but I think when it comes down to who are the influential voices, who are the larger delegates, I think they're people who are in those roles because they have their respect of the community. And that means that they are identified people.
I'll name one DAO I'm part of, and then I'll go into why I don't actually recommend DAOs. So we're part of Fundamental, great name. And it's about creating a DAO toolkit based out of Australia. We are too early with DAOs. Plutocratic governance systems only last so long until the money's on their own. And when outflows are greater than inflows, outflows go faster. So people generally only go there for speculative assets and missing returns. People and communities and groups and they come together and think DAOs going to solve their problems. Probably just find better people to hang out with, really. It sounds simplistic and sometimes even reductionist, but essentially DAOs are just cooperatives of people who want to make money most of the time. Chainhouse did a report a few years 2022 where it was 1% of the total members were able to make 99% decisions without any counter. Equally to that effect, there's a great website called DAO-Right. DAO-Right looks at the Gini coefficient of DAOs. Ladder DAO has a Gini coefficient of 0.93. South has a Gini coefficient of 0.63. Ladder DAO is more unequal in terms of wealth distribution than even the most unequal place in the world. So DAOs are too early, and I think if anyone was going to do a DAO, you should look at doing something simple. One thing first, see how it goes. Use reputation as opposed to capital value. If capital value go, with reputation you stake over time, people are willing to commit. That's Massimo doing his presentation for. So any DAO should have a reputation. So one token is a piece, one transfer of tokens, pixels you can create, and then allow that to create sentiment and value that.
Thank you. I'd like to comment on that. I think there's a big difference between what you might think of it as a naked DAO versus a DAO that exists to govern something that already exists and has value, right? If the DAO has a purpose of being the steward of something which exists and has value, and where decisions need to be made, then I think you're in a different position as opposed to just saying, let's make a DAO and then decide what to do. Because I think the politics of the DAO are much more natural if there is subject matter.
And we are very close to ending this, so we can go on. No, but we have a question from
people that are connected about the possibility of a DAO without a token, I guess, without incentive. And this, I would like to link this to the question to have. Do you have an incentive mechanism for these people that they are trying to recruit beyond their enthusiasm and the question in general, DAO, with or without incentives?
Good question. I am organizing two DAOs. One is Web3 research with DAO, as I mentioned, and also another is civic CoDecFin DAO. And for the Web3 research with DAO, we have no, we just only issue so non-transferable tokens only. So the token has no value for as a financial value, but they have kind of a sign of contribution. So and also they can use that NFTs to as a voting right. And only we have a issue that because at first it was difficult to create a mechanism, a token ecosystem. Yeah. So we are considering how we can utilize tokens for facilitating the people who want to contribute government rule making or research. So yeah, if anyone could please know.
I think Howard asked you know this yesterday, but one of the posters you put forward in the Solana token paper was something called SVGT, which is Solana governance token. We think that if you could have a semi-fungible Solana token, that would be able to be minted once, burnt once, no transfer at all, to whole contribution, as opposed to all these DAOs who are effectively creating securities to an extent. Obviously, you know, we'll worry about that. I think they're actually free from a wall. It's a very bad idea, naturally. So I think people should extract from capital value, go to reputation value, try to solve anonymity with accountability. And from there, we want to creating a really strong community to solve a single purpose. Is you should not try to solve everything. Do one thing right, go to the next. And so on.
Okay. I think we have to close here because we are 20 minutes into the COVID break. And there is another session, unless there is a very important last comment that anyone wants to add and close with. Okay, so thank you very much. And the coffee break is next to the bar.
And for the three session, we'll just start in 20 minutes for 10.
Yeah, the same for WTSC, the last session.
Go with that. You don't have anything, but I believe in the concept because it's supposed to manage. No way.